Welcome back, we continue. One thing, however, annoyed me a little. The box did not go into the extra street room. It was deposited into Wyatt's own, and there too it remained, occupying very nearly the whole of the floor, no doubt to the exceeding discomfort of the artist and his wife. This, the more especially as the tar or paint with which it was lettered in the sprawling capitals emitted a strong, disagreeable, and to my fancy, peculiarly disgusting odor. On the lid were painted the words, Mrs. Adelaide Curtis, Albany, New York. Charge of Cornelius Wyatt, Esquire. This side up to be handled with care. Now, as I was aware that Miss Adelaide Curtis of Albany was the artist's wife's mother, and then I looked upon the whole address as a mystification intended especially for myself. I made up my mind, of course, that the box and contents could never get farther than north of than the studio of my misanthropic friend in the Chambers Street, New York. For the first 3 or 4 days we had fine weather. Although the wind was dead ahead, having chopped around the northward, immediately upon our losing sight of the coast. The passengers were, consequently, in high spirits and disposed to be social. I must except, however, Wyatt and his sisters, who behaved stiffly, and I could not help thinking uncourteously to the rest of the party. Wyatt's conduct I did not so much regard. He was gloomy, even beyond his usual habit. In fact, he was morose. But in him I was prepared for eccentricity. For the sisters, however, I could make no excuse. They secluded themselves in their staterooms during the greater part of the passage and absolutely refused, although I repeatedly urged them, to hold communication with any person on board. Mrs. Wyatt herself was far more agreeable. That is to say, she was chatty, and to be chatty of no slight recommendation at sea. She becomes excessively intimate with most of the ladies, and to my profound astonishment evinced no equivocal disposition to coquet with the men. She amused us all very much. I say amused and scarcely know another word to explain myself. The truth is, I soon found Mrs. W. far oftener laughed at than with. The gentlemen said little about her, but the ladies, in a little while, pronounced her a good-hearted thing, rather indifferent-looking, totally uneducated, and decidedly vulgar. The great wonder was how Wyatt had been entrapped into such a match. Wealth was a general solution, but this I knew to be no solution at all, for Wyatt had told me that she neither brought him dollar nor had any expectations from any source whatsoever. He had married, he said, for love, and only for love, and his bride was far more worthy of his love. When I thought of these expressions on the part of my friend, I confess that I felt indescribably puzzled. Could it be possible he was taking leave of his sense? What else could I think? He was so refined, so intellectual, so fastidious at all, so exquisite a perception of the faulty, and so keen an appreciation of the beautiful. To be sure, the lady seemed especially fond of him, particularly so in his absence, when she made herself ridiculous by frequent quotations of what had been said by her beloved husband, Mr. Wyatt. The words husband seemed forever, to use one of her own delicate expressions, forever, on the tip of her tongue. In the meantime, it was observed by all on board that she avoided her in the most pointed manner, and, for the most part, shut himself up alone in the stateroom, where in fact he might have been said to live altogether, leaving his wife at full liberty to amuse herself as she thought best in the public society of the main cabin. My conclusion from what I saw and heard was that the artist, by some unaccountable freak of fate, or perhaps in some fit of enthusiastic, fanciful passion, had been induced to unite himself with a person altogether beneath him, and that the natural result, entire and speedy disgust, had ensued. I pitied him from the bottom of my heart, and could not, for that reason, quite forgive his incommunicativeness in the matter of the Last Supper. For this I resolved to have my revenge. One day he came on deck, and taking his arm, as had been my wont, I squandered with him backward and forward. His gloom, however, which I considered quite natural under the circumstances, seemed entirely unabated. He said little, and that moodily, and with evident effort. I ventured a jest or two, and he made a sickening attempt at a smile. Poor fellow, as I thought of his wife. I wondered that he could have heart to put on even a semblance of mirth. At last I ventured a home thrust. I determined to commence a series of covert insinuations or innuendos about the oblong box, just to let him perceive, gradually, that I was not altogether the butt or victim of a little bit of a pleasant mystification. My first observation by way of opening a masked battery said something about the peculiar shape of that box, and as I spoke the words I smiled knowingly, winked, and touched him gently with my forefinger in the ribs. The manner in which I received this harmless pleasantry convinced me at once that he was mad. At first he stared at me as if I found it impossible to comprehend the witticism of my remark, but at this point seemed slowly to make its way into his brain. His eyes, in the same proportion, seemed protruding from their sockets. There he grew very red, then hideous pale. Then, as if highly amused with which I had insinuated, he began a loud and boisterous laugh, which to my astonishment he kept up with a gradually increasing vigor for 10 minutes or more. In conclusion, he fell flat and heavy upon the deck. When I ran to uplift him, to all appearance, he was dead. I called assistance, and with much difficulty we brought him to himself. Upon reviving, he spoke incoherently for some time. At length we bled him and put him to bed. The next morning he was quite recovered so far as regarded his mere bodily health. Of his mind I say nothing. I guess he didn't really die. It's just all appearance he was dead. Okay. Of his mind I say nothing, of course. I avoided him during the rest of the passage. By advice of the captain, who seemed to coincide with me altogether in my views of his insanity, but cautioned me to say nothing on this head to any person on board. Several circumstances occurred immediately after this fit of Wyatt's which contributed to heighten the curiosity which I was already possessed. Among other things, this: I had been nervous, drank too much strong green tea, and slept ill at night. In fact, for 2 nights I could not be properly said to sleep at all. Now, my stateroom opened into the main cabin or dining room, as did all the single men on board. Wyatt's 3 rooms were in the after cabin, which were separated from the main one by a sliding door, never locked even at night. And as we were almost constantly on a wind, and the breeze was not a little stiff, the ship heeled to leeward very considerably, and whenever her starboard side went leeward, the sliding door between the cabins slid open. And so remained, nobody taking the trouble to get up and shut it. But my berth was in such a position that when my own stateroom door was open, as well as the sliding door in question, and my own door was always open on account of the heat, I could see into the after cabin quite distinctly, and just at that portion of it too where were situated the staterooms of Mr. Wyatt. Well, during 2 nights, not consecutive, while I lay awake, I clearly saw Mrs. W. about 11 o'clock upon each night steal cautiously from the stateroom of Mr. W. and enter the extra room, where she remained until daybreak, and she was called by her husband and went back. That they were virtually separated were clear. They had separate apartments, no doubt, in the contemplation of a more permanent divorce, and here, after all, I thought was a mystery of the extra seat. There was another circumstance, too, which interested me much. During the 2 wakeful nights in question, and immediately after the disappearance of Mrs. Wyatt into the extra stateroom, I was attracted by a certain singular, cautious, subdued noises of that of her husband. After listening to them for some time with thoughtful attention, I at length succeeded perfectly in translating their import. They were sounds occasioned by the artist in prying open the oblong box by means of a chisel and mallet, the latter being apparently muffled or deadened by some soft woolen or cotton substance on which its head was enveloped. take a break there and we'll finish up with part 3.